KBD fans has been improving on their designs like we've seen on the TF-V2, but sometimes it's a bit unclear if they would continue on this trajectory. The Bella was released at around the same time, and it was such a step back that I thought it belonged in 2018. But I realized different designs have different timelines for a relatively large entity like KBD fans, so it could totally be the case that the Bella was in the works for a long time, and the D65 here a little more recent, because this to me seems pretty good. With a relatively complicated assembly with many parts as well as a foam strip mounting system, this seems to check a lot of the boxes that people are looking for in a custom nowadays, but of course it wouldn't be a KBD fans board if they did everything perfectly. Designs from KBD fans seems to go one of two ways, very conservative so that it'll appeal to the widest audience and sell well, or really super out there and polarizing. The Tofu is an example of a conservative design, and the KBD 661 is a crazy one. I think this one falls right in the middle of the spectrum and stands adjacent to the Canoe and the Space 65. It works within the confines of a regular wedge, adding flares like removable blockers and asymmetry to spice it up a little. Looking from the top, it's got relatively thick bezels that's required to support the foam strip mount. The corners are round and the line is interrupted by the arrow key blocker. This appears to be a separate piece because it is, and you can get them in different colors as accents. This to me seems like a similar idea to the Bella's cat accent, and while the seam might be contentious, I'm a fan. For the first time in one of our design discussions, we'll have to look at the two side profiles separately. The left side is pretty much what's expected. None of the bottom is visible, and the top comes more or less all the way down, but with a floating look kinda like the Rama M65A. This approach to seamless design is my favorite versus the ones you see on AIO3's reference series. On the right, we see two segments interrupting the seamless lid. The more forward one is a continuation of the bottom case from the front, while the tiny square is yet another swappable accent. While there is more of it in the bottom, its side presence is hard to justify. A different color here would lead to a missing tooth look since your top and bottom are probably the same color. I don't think I would miss it if they got rid of it. Unlike most others, the front of the D65 is actually pretty interesting. The seamless left side wraps around, then is stopped by the bottom, creating asymmetry. For whatever reason, keyboard nerds are symmetry nuts, so this may bother you, but I think it works well here. The 65% layout is already asymmetrical, so assigning a bit more visual weight on the right side makes a lot of sense. Most cases have seams, and most of those avoid drawing any attention to it because they're typically an unavoidable side effect. My position is that if you're going to have a seam, you should own up to it and design for it rather than around it. The D65 does just that by accentuating the seam with bevels. It and the blocker overhang work together to further highlight the asymmetry. The rear is the most normal looking part of the keyboard. It's seamless throughout and only makes room for a USB Type-C cutout. I'm happy to see the two levels of recess on the port cutout that hide any trace of the cable shielding peeking out. Finally, moving on to the bottom, we have the continuation of the side accent as well as the standard fare for rubber feet. The weight is the same size and shape as the TF-V2 and the Bella, but it replaces the ugly KBD fans K with a black infilled logo. I haven't seen this in any other board and I think it's pretty cool. Wrapping it up, I think the D65 is the most consistently designed KBD fans board I've seen in a while, and it deviates from the norm tastefully. I hope their in-house designs continue this trend. If you've only seen anodized surfaces, the bright and glossy orange color might be throwing you off a bit. This so-called E-yellow finish is indeed this vibrant in person with a smooth paint-like finish. If you're the type to exactly match keycap color with a case, it might be a little hard to find something for this orange. If you're open to other combinations, most key sets use warm colors, and I think even something like 9009 here looks alright. The finish quality seems to be acceptable throughout. The only thing I found was a tiny little ding on the interior of the case, but otherwise the orange, like it or not, is consistent. I can't speak for other colors, but I know that black anodizing from KBD fans has been good recently, and I'm generally happy with their E finishes, so I don't have a problem recommending those. Let's now get into the assembly and also take a look at the components along the way. While not as complicated as the Vega, an instruction manual is provided, which is great to see. Keyboards have been getting more complicated lately, making these necessary. As usual, you need to install the foam strips first. The guide says to put it on the plate, just like the Polaris and the Vega, but unlike those, I explicitly recommend putting it on the case. The top and bottom cases have indents for the foam strips, probably for alignment. They're sized precisely, so if you're off by a bit, you'll end up squishing the foam at unintended positions, creating uneven pressure on the plate. This is made worse by the strips themselves that are too long. You'll want to trim them before use and put them into the case slots. With the foam sorted out, you can choose to install the hardware that fixes the PCB to the plate. This is for when you want to change the switches without taking the board apart. It shouldn't be a big issue for my aluminum plate, but I would discourage it for polycarbonate users since it could create hotspots for either feel or sound. Disassembling is hardly any more work than reinstalling switches anyway. Another thing between the PCB and the plate is the conductive foam. This uses the PCB from the KBD67 Mark II, which is top mount. The conductive foam would have electrically grounded the plate, which would then ground the rest of the case. Because the D65's keyboard assembly is insulated from the case by the foam strips, this solution ends up being ineffective. While shocks to the TF-V2, another keyboard with the same protections, are handled well, the D65 will disconnect temporarily. I hope to see the case grounding solution from the Vega in the future. One side note here, if you use the conductive foam, your plate foam won't be compatible. Pretty strange oversight, but maybe they already knew the conductive foam wouldn't work in this keyboard. As mentioned before, the two case halves are a little more complicated than in a regular top mount. It's got slots for the foam strips as well as various nooks and protrusions to implement the asymmetry. One part that I really like is this little indent on the bottom case that makes room for the arrow key blocker to slot in. They totally could have ended the blocker right at the seam, but this overhang plays a significant role in making the look more cohesive. Speaking of the blocker, it and the accent are removable by just one screw each. I would have liked to see a Torx head here instead of the Phillips because that's what the case screws use, but I guess most people won't be swapping these out. Complexity doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement. The bottom case's foam slot doesn't account for the plate, so if you press down hard enough, the plate will collide with the case. This is not a problem during normal use, but if the foam ends up degrading, you could end up with a scenario where the assembly is freely resting on the case. The KBD67 Mark II PCB looks pretty nice if you care about that and has per key RGB. Strangely, this isn't directly controllable through VIA like it was with the M60A. I think it'd be nice to see a daughter board here, but it's not really a big deal because the mounting isn't all that flexible. More on that later. When you're set with the internals, just align the foam strips if you put them on the plate, then close it up with 8 Torx head screws from the bottom. Here, you can see the standard KBD fan size brass weight. It's got the often cheap-looking brushed finish, but I think the factory infill job makes it look pretty good. It's also improved compared to the bent and poorly finished one in the Bella. The assembly process for the D65 is a little more involved than other boards, but it's mostly manageable. The pieces are finished nicely and fit together all right with minimal oversight. This seems like an improvement over the TF-V2, which itself was a big step forward. Love to see it. Marketing around foam strip mount tends to claim that the experience is somehow softer or otherwise more flexible. This makes intuitive sense, but it's not really so with my D65. To be fair, I can't comment on the experience with a polycarbonate plate, which surprisingly was offered this time around, but this aluminum plate just feels the same as a top-mounted one. When I put it together, I was shocked at just how stiff it was. Absolutely nothing in the way of vibrations that you'd find on a softer plate. If this was top mount, maybe you'd have a slight bit, but at this size, I doubt it. A contributing factor here is likely the fact that this has mounting points on the sides. This is generally not found on custom keyboards as it adds too much support, cancelling out any of the intended effects of the mounting mechanism. It's a strange choice given that there have been plenty of foam strip mount keyboards before this came along. They could have simply chosen to copy those, but they had to go do their own thing. Can't fault them for experimenting, but I guess we already kinda knew this. If you're not a fan of stiff bottom-out feels, I strongly recommend the polycarbonate plate because the experience with an aluminum plate is entirely unchanged when compared to top mount. This sounds like a typical aluminum keyboard without the hollowness I found on the Bella. There's an even amount of space under the PCB, and it comes with both plate and case foam if you want to use it. As always, sound tests are not representative of real life. If one more person talks about making sweeping conclusions to a board on this alone, I'm going to lose my mind. The case foam here almost entirely eliminates the low end, while the plate foam expectedly isolates the switch noise. I think it sounds plenty good without, but if you like having all of your keyboards sound the same, go ahead, I guess. It can be tough to tell what KBD Fans is doing, but it seems to me that they're starting to go somewhere with the new D series. I see they introduced it for the 60 and the 75 size as well. I wouldn't necessarily jump to grab one of those though, because the pricing seems to be out of whack, with the 60% kit costing more than a fully built 75% version. Maybe KBD Fans is testing the waters on how much they can charge. Of the three, I think the D65 is the most visually interesting with its asymmetry. Being able to change accents on two different spots on the board is a novel concept, but realistically, not a lot of people are going to do it. I think most people would be happy if the seams were just faked, kind of like the fake screws on the Space 65 Cyber Voyager. When paired with an aluminum plate, the typing feel is super stiff, but I appreciate that polycarbonate is an option. The sound is perfectly acceptable with or without foam, and overall, I think you'd be happy with one. Oftentimes, Western designs tend to focus on minimalism, which results in a million variety of metal rectangles, and it's a breath of fresh air to see unconventional designs explored like here. This feels like a contemporary take on something like the Canoe, and I'm all for it. The cheapest configuration is about $270 before shipping, which is really starting to inch up to regular group buy territory. For reference, my E6.5 was about $350, and the Space 65 about $280. KBD Fans has previously been about value, but it seems like they just want to compete with other customs now. That's all fine and good, other entry outlets are going to pop up, but that also means I'm going to hold them to a higher standard. The daughterboard cable issue on the TF-V2 was unacceptable, the entirety of the Bella was unacceptable, but this seems like it's alright. Or at least not any worse than group buy boards that can also be incredibly janky. One last note is that I've been asked to compare this with a Vega, but that's difficult because I don't have the same plate material and there's more than $100 price difference compared in stock to in stock. If I were to speculate, the D65 will probably have a slightly stiffer feel thanks to the side mounting points. Pretty exciting, the kind of boards that are relatively easily available nowadays. I've got an NK65, Portico, and a Kara, but I don't know if I could call those really custom. Leave a comment down below what you'd consider an entry-level custom keyboard in 2021.